Welcome to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It is great to be with you today on Saturday. Sorry, we're a couple minutes late. We had a couple of technical difficulties we sorted out. I'm super excited that Mikey is joining us. Many of you probably know Mikey from Tankie Therapy or Tankie Group Therapy, which is often hosted either on the Anti Empire podcast with Justin Podor, or sometimes also the East is a podcast with Sina Rahmani. They do great work, and shout out to all of them. And Mikey is joining us from Hawaii, where it is 6:06 a.m. And so also shout out for that, because I don't think I have that level of dedication myself. So much appreciated, Mikey. And also just want to acknowledge the time. I know that this is running in the time slot that Saturdays with Renee runs. And, um, you know, just apologies that I don't usually try to do that, but sometimes it happens. And in this case, it was just the time that Mikey and I could both do it. But also shout out to Renee and Jared Ball and Kahinde Andrews. And I know they have the Abandoned Harris folks on today. So I'm sure that's going to be a great episode, and either watch it after this or go over there and watch that and come back and watch this later. We shout out them and the work that they do. Um, all right. So I'm going to bring Mikey to the stage. Mikey is an organizer and a filmmaker. And I'll say a few words up front, and then we'll kind of get into it. And Mikey, good to be with you.
Hey, thanks. Great to be back, Jared. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Yeah, and for folks who don't know, we had Mikey on the audio podcasts a couple years ago to talk about the shutdown Red Hill, kind of movement in Hawaii, and that was a great conversation that I really appreciated. I know a lot of other people did too, so I encourage people to check that out if they didn't listen to it. Um, and yeah, so I mean, there's so much to talk about. Part of me is I never want to talk about US elections ever again. And, we hadn't really done it in the past, but we did this year partly because um, it just felt like, I don't know, I think some of it was being on YouTube, and people on YouTube, and a lot of people asked, like, what do you think? And, so we had some conversations about it. Um, but I'm glad to be leaving that. I'm glad to be moving out of a world in which we need to really focus on talking about the U.S. election. Not that we needed to, but I'm glad to not feel the need to. And obviously, Donald Trump has been reelected, which is not something that anybody wanted at all. Except for, of course, the 70 some million people who voted for him probably did. But we'll talk, of course, about the kind of crappy choices, false choices that we have in a lot of ways within our society, I'm sure, today. And I think, one of the things that I saw, that I'm just going to pull this up as somebody, we, titled this discussion. One of the folks that often listens and watches our show, I know, um, brought up this point of setting the bounds of any possibility is an important role of counterinsurgency. And so that I just kind of, in some ways, wanted to start there, because I think this is one of the, if you think about elections as counterinsurgency, and I know there's a lot of different opinions on that, some people might not think of it that way, but um, that is an important role of counterinsurgency, is to say, these are your choices within the system. Like, these are your options. These are the policies and the figures that you can choose between. And anything outside of that, you can't, basically, like, not in, at least not in this process. Right. And I think that, yeah, I guess I just would start there a little bit with, thinking maybe if you have some initial reflections on that, on how the elections just really limit politics to such a point that it's difficult to even talk about, US elections. It's almost not a political thing in a lot of ways, right? It's a very personality, image, identity kind of driven, um, you know, process. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost like kind of personal branding, and it's like a, Coke or Pepsi kind of argument at this point. In that sense, it is incredibly depoliticized because it's so emptied of content. It's more like a personal preference when you're walking down a grocery aisle and deciding what kind of toothpaste looks the coolest to you, right? But it's also like elections and the hyper focus in the United States on electoral politics being the only avenue for getting plugged in politically into the system in any meaningful way, I think is really important to really interrogate. As much as I think all of us on the left fucking just hate how much it pervades every single aspect of our lives throughout the 4 years until an election, right? And the midterm elections to a lesser extent, every 2. And I think there's this thing that happens when all of the media in the United States, and to a larger extent, like Western media, focuses on the sum total of US politics being around the next election. And going back to to I think one of the canards we constantly hear leading up to the election coming at it from the left is that revolutionary people or people of the left are single issue voters. In this case, the single issue being genocide, right? And how that's strangely a deal breaker for many people. I think many Americans who are only involved in the political process through electoral politics, that is their single issue. The single issue vote for many voters in the United States is the election. And I think the Democrats are single issue voters on getting the next Democratic president elected, or really just trying to define themselves in contradistinction to the Republican president of the times, right? And I think in terms of narrowing the bounds of what is politically possible and how one can get politically engaged within the US imperial core is really bounded by those exclusively electoral politics. Because imagine as a regular person who isn't that politically engaged but wants to be involved somehow, all the politics that you and all the news that you receive, right? And the lens through which you view everything that happens around the world is kind of put through this, you know, distorted looking glass around electoral politics. Like, what does this mean for the president right now? And what's it going to mean leading into the primaries and the general election? And when you look at it that way, like that is such a tiny level of involvement for the average person, where they only get involved every 2 to 4 years, and it precludes any kind of accountability or connectedness to your actual community, let alone the global community, right? Because if your entire politics focuses on all of the conditions that I hope to be improved have to do basically with me and me alone, right? And there can be some level of kind of uh token solidarity handed out to the people that the Democratic Party will tell you are people who are at risk, even though they'll do nothing to actually concretely help those people in any material way. And and I think it allows for not just a really limited political imagination of the possible, but also really constrains one's sense of empathy, right? Because I think if everything is focused on getting your next guy elected, everyone else becomes part of that terrible analogy of the two train tracks, right? Everyone can be laid on those tracks if that's exclusively what your politics are focused on, where your future relies entirely on marginal improvements made along false promises by a party who's trying to get the next guy elected, or woman in this case. And I think it all goes back to the constant harping on needing to vote for the lesser of two evils, right? Because the only thing that matters is getting the power of a slim majority in the House and Senate, along with commander in chief, to bring about those incremental changes, and that you must be willing to accept any lesser evil, right, compared to the Republicans. And I think the problem with that argument is that that lesser evil argument has led to the Democratic Party engaging in the greatest evil. There is no lesser evil than what the United States is committing in occupied Palestine right now. There's no lesser evil than genocide. And I think we've kind of reached the termination of that unsustainable case, right? In Palestine. And I think a lot of young people and a lot of people generally, regardless of demographic, have realized this. And I think we should go into some of the other data points in terms of the turnout for this election. But I think the only really relevant data point is the people who stayed home this election, right? Because no matter what any liberal can say about third party votes, there is not a single swing state where that actually would have mattered, right? Especially when you consider that many third party voters aren't being swayed and straddling the fence ambivalently between whether they should vote for Jill Stein or Claudia de la Cruz or Harris, right? It's the decision between staying home and voting third party. And the most relevant data point is who stayed home, which is like 11 million voters from the previous election. Yeah. So I think
Yeah,
in order for us to get into kind of like what's next, I think we do need to actually really dig down into uh what moves people into electoral politics and what moves them out, because I think we are seeing an actual significant exodus away from even viewing that paltry level of political involvement as viable for a lot of people. And I think after elections like this, it is a kind of like crisis point where people are movable. And I don't think we should waste a whole bunch of time on the worst of the worst liberals who are willing to displace all of their feelings of insecurity and incompetence onto the most marginalized communities in the imperial core. But I do think there are a lot of maybe questioning liberals or just people who want to live in a better world, in a kinder world, right, and be a part of that, who I think we do actually really need to actively re-educate and try to organize.
100%. Yeah, and I think that one of the things I did want to talk about is the way that obviously some of these, which I agree, I don't want to waste a whole lot of time talking about it, but there has been this kind of interesting outpouring on social media of people who are, making TikToks and making tweets, right, about, oh, Arab voters didn't want to vote for, the president that's already genociding them. And
Yeah.
and so, good luck. Gaza's going to be a parking lot, right? This kind of thing, as if Gaza has not already been turned into a parking lot by Joe Biden and
Mhm.
Kamala Harris, a great deal of it, right?
Yeah.
Um, but you have that sentiment, you have these jokes that people are making about calling ICE on Latinos for voting for Trump. You have these kind of things. And I think one of the things that happens, right? And you saw it happening even it was fascinating. I watch a lot of election night coverage on the different channels to see how they are spinning and thinking and what messaging they're putting out as things are happening. And it was very interesting with particularly MSNBC and like CNN, the very liberal, mainstream channels, the way that even before they were sure that Harris was going to lose, when they started to get worried, they immediately started going to demographics and looking at turnout numbers among different groups and looking at shifts. I mean, and in a large part, all of these subgroups that they looked at did vote for Harris more than they voted for Trump, right? The
Mhm.
one group of which that is not true at all is white people, right? But there was no discussion of that. Um,
Yeah.
but I think that it's very, one of the things is that also the way that this process puts people in these huge categories, which are not at all politically meaningful for us on the left. I mean, what is a Latino or a Hispanic, as they call them on Fox News? Like,
Yeah.
it could be anything from, a Cuban, former slave owner or a Venezuelan capitalist, right? To
Mhm.
somebody who is a poor migrant from, Guatemala or Mexico that's been fleeing, some kind of fascistic violence within their own like there's huge
Mhm.
distinctions between these populations. A lot of them are fleeing US sanctions, right? Or US
Yeah.
imperialism themselves. Um,
A
and
lot of them
it's
can't
not
vote.
a lot of them can't vote, right? And there are a whole set of different nationalities that we're talking about here, people with different historical experiences. Um, and the same thing with any of these groups that they point at, whether that's, quote unquote black voters, um, whether it's Arab voters. And I mean, to break that down, I think is wild because also I think there's a complete inability to reckon with what does it mean to experience a genocide and to then have people tell you you have to put your issue aside for my personal interests and safety in this moment, which is what a lot of messaging was around people who were supportive of Kamala Harris. um, and so, yeah, I mean, I think that there's a whole way in which the media starts to pull out these, and there's also never any discussion of class, of course. Maybe there'll be some discussion of income levels, maybe some discussion of, college education levels and things like this. But all of that is obscured. So it's like the complete opposite of like social investigation and class analysis, or like something where you're
Mhm.
actually trying to figure out like what groups of people could I build solidarity with, could I work with to put together some kind of political coalition to fight for our collective solidarity and interests. It's a total opposite of that process. And it's a kind of scapegoating, right, of huge groups of people, except for white people, of course, who just don't exist in this equation, right? And I think that that process then kind of dovetails into social media too, where you see these really horrendous takes, and also the things like I guess there was a Starbucks, thing this week where people were going to Starbucks to end the boycott of Starbucks that
And
has
McDonald's,
been
yeah.
related. Yeah, McDonald's, right?
They're
And
basically going
um
on, like, food
go ahead.
binges, like, it's just it's I wanna say cringe, but it's also kind of pitiful and embarrassing, and I think yeah, that in particular, I think is noteworthy just because it's kind of, like, farcical, just to see that they're trying to, like, own the people who they think have harmed them when 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 it's just some yeah, like you said, a really amorphous kind of, like, political demographic that doesn't really mean anything, like, what is Latino? What is Asian, right? Like, what does it mean to slot people into categories even by gender, like male and female, without any kind of class analysis, right? Like, men men vote for men and women vote for women. Like, it doesn't actually mean anything, and it's not even borne out by the data. Like, if you look at the actual demographic changes in the election from Biden to Harris, like, there's like a 1% difference in this amorphous Latino category, right? It's there's a 2% drop off between for women from Biden to Harris, which was really interesting, right? So like the trying to blame entire communities for the loss of an election where again 11 registered Democrats didn't show out to vote for Kamala Harris. Like I think we're definitely missing the forest for some very small trees. But going back to the kind of like Starbucks, McDonald's revenge TikToks, right? I think it's really indicative of the kind of constrained political imaginations that have been produced by the hyper focus in US politics on elections, where people's political imaginations are so blinkered under this capitalist hellscape that the best thing that they think they can do to avenge themselves against people who they perceive to have harmed them is going on a hamburger jihad, right? Like that's like the extent of their imaginations. I'm going to consume in order to get back at the people who have wronged me, to the people who should have quote unquote shown up for me. And it's really tragic in this case because many of these folks are referring to the rebellion that happened, the uprising of George Floyd's martyrdom, right? And they're referring specifically to who they consider to be Arabs, but specifically Palestinians who haven't shown up for Black lives. When you look at Palestine, and there are like at least 4 murals of George Floyd on the separation walls in the West Bank. Yahya Sinwar, in one of his last interviews with an English-speaking network, invoked the memory of George Floyd to demonstrate an inextricable connection between the plight of Palestinians in Gaza specifically and to the struggle in the United States for Black people's liberation. And so I think a lot of this bitterness and this lashing out, this lateral violence that we're seeing as a result of the elections is one on that individual level, just the kind of like idiocy and pettiness, but on a broader level is just like a lot of Americans just being so thoroughly undereducated or miseducated about what's actually going on in the global community, that they don't really see any way out of this hyper individualized, consumption focused, electorally focused snow globe. And I think the United States by design tries to portray people like in the DPRK or in Cuba or in Iran as like a hermit kingdom that's like hermetically sealed off from the rest of the world, and how billions of people actually in reality um feel a deep connection to each other and express deep solidarity. And I think that's actually the case for the United States. I think the United States is a hermit kingdom when it comes to this lack of solidarity, this lack of feeling deeply connected, inextricably connected to people around the world, despite the fact that the United States as a colonial entity and an imperialist hegemon has the most deep connections in a negative way to all the rest of the third world.
100%. No, I think that's a really good point too on this idea of the United States as a hermit kingdom. I mean, it is. It is like there's no. Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things, let's see, you brought up a couple points, and there was one thing. Oh, so I'm gonna bring up. So there's also this point I want to make about sort of left liberal influencers. And this, just because I have to, I
Yeah,
mean,
no, it's
these.
fun and it's so bizarre.
Well, I mean, there's so I'll bring up a picture. I'm gonna do a particular person, and no apologies to them, because they don't
Absolutely.
deserve any. But one of the people that had gained a lot of followers, and interest
Oh god.
um,
Yeah.
post George Floyd, right? And like very much branded themselves as an abolitionist,
Mhm.
did some political education and stuff like this around abolition. Of course, is most famous, people probably know from a really good segment actually on the Breakfast Club where she took down what's his name, Eric Adams, right?
Mhm. Yeah,
And
it was
and
good. It was a
so
good interview.
it was good, and but you could see very early on, I mean, months and months ago, that she was going to use this moment to put all of her energy around the Harris campaign and spent a lot of time making really bad faith videos and attacks on anybody to her left that was, suggesting either third party or, suggesting that this is a case of, two incredible evils and that we shouldn't be. I mean, as you said, I think one of the points you made is the real question on the left was whether to stay home or whether to vote for third party. It wasn't like which third party
Mhm.
candidate am I going for. Most of the people I think stayed home. And even that, I mean, that is part of why I haven't historically done a lot of shows about elections, is because I actually think staying home is a perfectly reasonable thing for people to do given these
Absolutely.
options. I really do. Um, but this is what she wrote: is I will not be lending my voice to any cause or tragedy that comes as a result of Americans handing Donald Trump the presidency, the courts, the House, and the Senate. According to y'all, fascism was already here, and it's all the same. Please remember that and keep that same energy when shit gets crazy for you. I see a lot of working class, underprivileged, already marginalized people thinking they're dunking on me and other progressives and immigrants. I've literally received thousands of comments and messages from people who think the joke is on me. And I'm here to remind y'all I'm an attorney with a successful career. I'm going to be all right. Y'all are going to be the ones who truly suffer. Dumbasses voted for your own oppression and thinking you're dunking on progressives, a far more educated and privileged base, fatally stupid. I mean, this could not be like a worse message to put out as a person who thinks of themselves on the left. Um, I can't even imagine, like I can't imagine any circumstance in which things did not go the way that I wanted them to in any kind of really arena, but it's specifically within electoral politics, where my response would be that I'm not going to show up for any people who face oppression or are marginalized. I mean, that's the whole purpose of what the left is, right? Is to
Mhm.
actually show up for everybody that is facing, oppression, that is under capitalist exploitation and imperialism and so on. Like, and we often fail to that, but that is like the thing that we're supposed to be doing, and so
Yeah.
I just found that such a disgusting thing, and it's also indicative of the fact that I haven't seen this person do anything other than sort of left punditry and,
Yeah. And left
bringing
punching.
themselves in left punching, right? Yeah, really, it's not left punditry. It's really left punching. But it's branded, right? She self brands as
Mhm.
progressive, um,
Mhm.
and as a leftist. Sometimes she will call herself a leftist,
Yeah.
which is an
Which is why we have to
interesting word
stop
in
using that
itself.
term. It's so nebulous. Yeah, it doesn't mean it's a
Yeah.
catch-all term.
Yeah.
It's like saying Asians and Latinos as an all-encompassing demographic of the entire like left that bleeds all the way into center politics. So, yeah, it's a useless
Yeah.
term.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I agree with this. And actually, Brooke, you were the first person who kind of wasn't really paying attention, but you were the first person who mentioned this to me, actually. And I agree. I mean, it was actually very easy if we didn't fall into that viral moment with Eric Adams, which again was a good moment. Like, you could see this trajectory going way back to 2020 with her, and it's a shame. And I think that's one of the things too that I really want to encourage people to let go of, is this kind of left influencer culture, like this idea. I mean, if the platforms aren't truly having honest conversations and self-critical ones, and engaging with all kinds of different thinkers, these ones that are just promoting themselves as like a brand and the place to go, and this is what you need to do, and it's all somehow related to the Democratic Party as the vision of the left. Like, this should be a huge red flag for people in terms of like what they're watching and consuming in terms of like a media diet, because I do think there's a lot of people out here who do good work in a genuinely anti-capitalist or anti-imperialist media space. But we have to move away from these folks who so clearly are in it for themselves. I mean, you can't get more in it from yourself than that statement right there.
Yeah. Gosh, there's so much to unpack in that statement. But first, I want to kind of address the kind of explosion of political TikTokers and kind of media creators and producers of political content. I think a lot of that is a product of the kind of stage of capitalism we're in, where one job is not even going to be close to enough. So I think a lot of people have kind of dabbled into content creation, bought themselves like a nice mic, and I think are trying to get a platform that is monetizable while also doing something that they think I genuinely believe in, right? But because they are undereducated and haven't actually entered into a revolutionary political consciousness and are doing it for the clicks and for the engagement, I think when they feel a sense of genuine grief over a political defeat, they don't really know how to process that, so they will lash out online and try to get their dopamine hit through takes. And I think we have this kind of like take industrial complex that's developing, where a lot of people will be, directly incentivized through these platforms to have the most kind of reactionary or drastic kind of take on a thing like this, where they will be like genuinely encouraging people to call ICE on, you know, Latino Trump voters, or to call for the entire elimination of Gaza after claiming to have abided by BDS lists for the past year. And I think we have to be really wary about trying to extrapolate kind of the videos, those extreme videos that do go viral, as being part of some kind of majority. But I do think it's also something to take into consideration that, like, for a lot of people, especially in the younger generations, like everything is basically subsumed into content creation. and and I don't know if there's something that like there's any way of organizing around that. I think that's just something that we're going to have to deal with in the future, in terms of getting people outside of uh every political thought having to be kind of like squeezed through this tube of content creation, and to get them to actually do political analysis. But we have to do engage in that work. But going back to that post, I don't know if you can put it back up again, because I think it's worth kind of dissecting a lot of parts there. um but like, I don't even know if she realizes in that tweet that she's paraphrasing kind of like George Jackson in one part, like fascism is already here. Like that is a
No,
genuinely
no,
correct statement.
I
Yeah.
think that she's so people said that to her, right?
Oh my,
They
yeah.
so that's what she's replying to the George Jackson analysis
Yeah.
and saying they're wrong, and now you get to feel what it's really like. This is so it's a very, I mean, this is the thing, is such a punitive take too. Like it's like I
Yes,
want to
it's deeply
punish people for not
carceral,
doing what I
ironically.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this person calls themselves an abolitionist, but this is incredibly punitive, incredibly carceral language, but also really portrays solidaristic politics as the exact opposite of solidarity. This is deeply transactional politics, right? And but it's also, you can see the delusions of grandeur that comes with being poisoned by this uh kind of like social media sphere of content creation, where there's this heavy delusions of grandeur, right? Where this person believes that the most effective political thing they can do on these platforms, as a punitive measure, is to withhold her takes from the people, right? It's like it's like, political take Jesus kind of like leaving planet Earth. It's like, oh, you've forsaken me, so now I'm going to forsake you by withholding my brilliance. And and I think it's a really good indication of how much these platforms can kind of poison our brains, because this is also a very clearly intelligent person, right? Who has done good work in the legal field. But it's like, when you get too lost in the sauce, like, you can really kind of lose your mind. Which I think is also something that we on the revolutionary left need to be careful about, because yeah, staying too much on Twitter, and I'm saying this to myself as well, like it can really poison your brain, and really get you to lose sight of the necessary work that we need to be engaging in both on and offline, more so
Yeah.
offline.
No, 100%, 100%. And I think that, there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, one, it just is designed to, take up our time. Another is that we really are inundated with information to such a degree that is like not healthy for our brains too. Um, but also we see these takes and they get spread virally, even by those of us who are, making fun of them or whatever. And like, it tends to, as you said, produce a feeling that these phenomena are more widespread too than they actually are, right? And that these takes represent how more people feel than they actually do. And I don't want to dismiss that there are plenty of people out here who actually are expressing their politics in this way. And I think it is, again, it's a symptom of what you talked about earlier, of this idea that the end all be all of politics is elections in the United States. That this, our ability to vote every 4 years, or every 2 years if you're somebody who votes in midterms, which a lot of people don't. Um, that these are, the end all be all of political expression, and you don't really engage in politics outside of that, right? And so when you lose, then yeah, you could be frustrated and fall into, as you say, like this sort of consumerist rebellion, or this, a boycotting, I guess. I think Josh had a tweet. I guess some people are talking about sex strikes and these kinds of things, as responses, um, rather than, okay, we need to actually get together and organize now. We need to, I mean, hopefully people are doing it already, but like if not, and I do think this is the point you brought up too early about the number of people who stayed home. I mean, I've seen a lot of people starting to follow our platform after the election that weren't before. And so I recognize too that people are going to be looking in these times too of different ways to plug in. There are going to be a lot of people who are going to be like, okay, like I'm scared, but I also want to organize. I also, need to find people who are going to keep going, who are not going to just fall into despair or accept what's going on. I mean, and that's the interesting thing too about the liberal reaction that I see offline too when I'm walking around in my community or at school or whatever with my kids, is like that there was this deep sense of devastation once they realized Trump had won, which I was familiar with. And I mean, I felt it very much the first time that he was elected, and I get it. Um, but on the other side of that too, there's like, you know, there's the devastation, but there's also like that there's not a plan, that there's not a that there and there's also in some ways a certain level of acceptance, I think, this time around from a lot of liberals, right? Of like,
Yeah.
okay, the majority of the country wants this. It's got a mandate. It's going to have probably all centers of government and power. Um, and there's not, all we can do is plan for 2 and 4 years out of how we're going to try to elect Democrats again to stop this, right? And I think that's something we have to be cautious with too, because I think there are some on the left that might think that this will create this groundswell of people into a kind of anti-fascist movement, which we saw a little bit more in 2017, um, that we may not see this time around, because there may not be liberals who are as interested in anti-fascism or whatever in this moment as there were the last time around. But I do think there's going to be a lot of people who are looking to deepen their political analysis, who are interested in forms of struggle that don't, follow this cycle of electoralism and so on. And so I think that's the other side of it, is that I think people um, who see themselves or work in those spaces or want to be in those spaces should, and need to seize the moment that way. because it is going to be a scary 4 years in terms of, just as the last 4 years was scary and the 4 years before that, right? There's going to be a lot of horrendous policy that they're going to seek to implement, and we've seen this agenda going back for decades, and it just gets worse with each president, it seems like.
Hmm. Yeah, and while it is going to get worse under Trump, as it did, the last time he was in office, I think part of what has been so demobilizing for a lot of regular voters is the fact that things got worse through Biden in all the ways that were supposed to be only something that would happen under Trump. And I think, in contrast to previous administrations, just because of the rapidity with which this capitalist empire is imploding, because it's reached the frontiers of all of its extractive, imperialist efforts, I think, uh, due to those deepening contradictions, it's becoming just much, much more visible, even to kind of like lay people, where even any liberal whose social media algorithms are completely catered to kind of like wall to wall Rachel Maddow type politics, you're gonna get Gaza in your feed, right? No matter what you try to do, even with the suppressive algorithms, you're going to see the horrors that are committed in your name. And I think even on the economic side, despite the fact that, so many liberal pundits in particular show graphs indicating how things are improving, right? And the economy is fine because Biden saved it. I think people realize that they're not showing you the right data, right? That day to day, people's dollar buys much, much less than it used to, and people are getting paid completely unsustainable wages and getting deep into all kinds of debt, and we'll never be able to afford to buy a house within multiple lifetimes under the wages that they're currently earning, despite how hard they're working. And I think what we're getting at, kind of like political avenues for radicalization and actual plugging people into movement work. I think, yeah, when we saw kind of like upswell during the uprisings around 2016, 2017, I think part of the problem was that we didn't have an actual kind of like revolutionary party to catch people into. So a lot of people got into kind of anarchistic direct action, which had varying degrees of success, but all of which have taken different forms since then, and mutual aid, which also has its value, but without an actual concrete long-term political project to plug into, it rapidly becomes indistinguishable from charity, right? And the type of certain faction of DSA electoral politics, which was also demobilizing in its own respect, because it was so hard for many people, especially people just entering political work, myself included, to actually get any wins within a rigged political system, right? So that had its own kind of demobilizing effect, where trying to work within the political system, even on the local level, the electoral system, to get so-called socialist, democratic socialist candidates elected, yielded very little returns. And the few that were able to get elected, like the squad, like people like AOC and Jamal Bowman, ended up being really mask off traitors, not just to the movement to free Palestine, but also just completely being swallowed up by Democratic Party politics, where they're taking pictures with ghouls like Joe Biden and ride or dying with him, well beyond the point where even liberals would stay by their man. So yeah, I think lacking a revolutionary political party that has the kind of like pull and direct sway and deep connection and relation within communities, I I don't think that there will be any way to transition people who are trying to find a way out of this rigged political system into actual movement building. And so I think that's the work that we actually have to engage in, because there isn't anything to catch people like in terms of like a political home as they're falling into the abyss of complete political disengagement. I think we really have to be honest with ourselves within the U.S. Imperial Court that we don't have that, and that we are years away from actually building it, right? Being able to build something that actually has leverage. And I think this was kind of, I think, a misapprehension for many people on the left when the genocide in Palestine entered into this new extermination phase. Is a lot of people, even people who kind of claim a communist tendency, were like, why don't we in America just do something, right? And I think that there is a lot that can be done and a lot more that should be done, but the only things that can actually like hold this empire to account and bring it to its knees, like actually blocking choke points of capital and logistics, we're years away from actually having that kind of organizational power to actually execute it, right? So I think if there's anything to kind of damn the left within the U.S., such as it is, many people would say it's non-existent. I tend to agree. There's no organized left in the United States. Uh, I think if one is to condemn the U.S. left, the disorganized U.S. left, it would be that we haven't built that yet, right? And the only way that we can actually build enough power to stop it is by having an actual party, a vanguard party that's going to be able to have the organizational power to actually you know go on strikes that actually have millions of people involved, rather than like a hyper individualized strike, like 4B or um BDS, or at this point anti-BDS. Like while those things may be cathartic and have like in the case of like a 4B type action, have kind of like a good intention behind it, it's not something that can really be scaled up to a mass movement. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that the politics are around it are still kind of constrained within this hyper individualized sense of how one gets involved in politics, rather than a international solidaristic view of things. And I think it's ultimately, I think, a result of lesser evilism, where um, it's just about the choices you can make personally to um, kind of prevent the constantly escalating systemic violence from ratcheting up even further. And as we can see, the only thing that's done is just constantly reproduce it in different forms.
Yeah, no, I think that's I agree with, I think, most of what you're saying there. And I think that the tricky part then becomes sort of where do people start, because I think that you know the there I think there could be some response to what you're saying that I would want to avoid, which would be to sort of suggest that people shouldn't then start somewhere, right?
Hmm.
Because the if the apparatus of the Revolutionary Vanguard Party, for instance, doesn't already exist, right? Then like I do think that there's a lot of different things that people can do in terms of organizing to try to start to walk towards that, or to try to
Oh,
start
yeah,
to build
absolutely.
towards that.
Yeah.
And I think that it the there yeah, so I think that's true, but I do think that you're right in terms of, in general, on the left, that we do have this very individualist, kind of orientation, myself included, quite often, to be totally self-critical, right? Of what can I do? What am I gonna, how am I gonna pitch into this or be a part, and it does in many ways reproduce a kind of charity logic, or a kind of, which, makes total sense. I mean, that's the way I was raised, right? Is, in the
Mhm.
church and these kind of things, right? Of how do you sort of help others who are less fortunate, this kind of thing, as opposed to actually joining something and, working with your comrades and trying to build something, and also submitting yourself to some kind of collective form of accountability as well, in terms of what are you all going to do and what are your commitments with each other and so on. That's not just based on, what do I want to do as an individual? How much of myself am I willing to give to this? What form will that take, etc. Right? Um, so yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I think, yeah. Go ahead.
Well, no, yeah, I wanna kind of like, uh, clarify that, like, I I don't think, like, lacking a vanguard party that we shouldn't try to do something, right? I think that there is an impulse, coming from a genuinely good place where people are just like, I will do anything, right? I just need to do something. And I think we should follow that impulse, but then not let it, I think we have to create bumper lanes, right? So that people don't just start engaging in completely adventurous activities, or just in things that we know, like, if they are just completely self-contained, will end up turning into just like a book club, right? Or a recurring charity event that will eventually spin out, inevitably into internal conflict and burnout. I think people should definitely try to seek out or start their own, mutual aid collectives. They should definitely start engaging in collective political education, which definitely includes reading groups, getting involved in political activities wherever they live, or starting their own political activities wherever they live, wherever and however they can. But also keeping in mind, especially people who are in a more advanced stage of political consciousness, to make sure that we're plugging them into a movement with legs, right? Or at least building towards that. We're all just trying to build towards that in the US Imperial Court, because we don't have it yet, right? And I think in order to actually scale up to the level where we can demonstrate meaningful, powerful international solidarity, that's got to be the mission. Or else we're just going to go through the same, like, internal left boom and bust cycle, where there will be a major crisis, like a natural disaster or an electoral disaster, or a kind of crisis abroad, like in Palestine and Lebanon, and there will be all this emotional energy that can't be converted, because there's no machine to do it, converted into revolutionary energy.
Yeah, 100%. I appreciate that clarification. I think
Mm.
that's right on. And I do want to also plug tomorrow. Kali Akuno is going to come back on also to talk a little bit about his thoughts on, where we go from here. So I encourage people to tune into that as well. But I appreciate those, those thoughts on what should be done. And another thing I was thinking about too, so one of the things that you find within, I was talking to Orasami Burton about this morning, because he and I have talked about this, of within counterinsurgency literature, there's this idea of frustration tolerance.
Hmm.
And I'm going to actually pull up a piece. So this is from one of the books behind me. Uh, so it's a good read. I encourage people to check it out. It's called The Ungovernable Society, The Rise or a Genealogy of Authoritarian Liberalism. Um, and but it's a book where he quotes heavily from like what the ruling class and key figures in executive leadership and management were talking about in the early 1970s, basically, right? So obviously a period of intense crisis, of rebellion, of world revolutions, and so on, right? And this was one of the takeaways, right? This was as they were talking about a very kind of militant workforce at the time, and a workforce where, because there was almost full employment at the time, people could just walk off the job and go find work somewhere else, right? Which was actually a very good position for labor to be in at that time. Um, but they said this is them sort of, again, a lot of these quotes are coming from different ruling class figures. This is a Ford executive. The source of our present difficulties with the workforce might be deemed a general lowering of employees' frustration tolerance. This idea that there are variable levels of frustration tolerance came from the psychology of behavior. At the end of the 1930s, American researchers had conducted experiments on chimpanzees, from which it emerged that in individuals with little experience of frustration early in their life, insufficient frustration tolerance will be developed for meeting the frustrations of later years. These psychologists concluded that a cardinal task of education, properly understood, was not so much to enable a young person to blossom as the building up of frustration tolerance through discipline. This theory of punitive disciplining by an ogre figure explained deviant behavior in a similar way. An indocile individual is a subject whose level of tolerance to frustration is pathologically low. To cure him, he must be taught to rein in his desires. Re-education or psychotherapy is a process of building up frustration tolerance by allowing the patient to experience small or intolerable doses of frustration until resistance is gradually developed and the areas of low frustration tolerance disappear. So again, like, I'm not going to read all of this, but basically, they saw worker revolts as manifestations of this psychological immaturity, right? And so the point was to increase the degree of frustration tolerance that people had, and as they say, this was something that they looked at through education. It's something that, so our school system, right? And we think about how frustrating our school systems are in the United States. Um, and I think about this too with like social media, right? And in terms of like this idea too, we talk about what are we normalizing and stuff like that a lot, and this idea of like, what does it mean to like subject the whole world to the visage, to be watching ongoing genocide and to see all of these images. I mean, babies without heads, like people burning alive, right? And to then also present them with a world in which, as it exists right now, like you said, people don't feel like they can do much, which in reality is partially true, right? Because they, as you said, we haven't achieved the levels of organization that would be necessary to actually be able to make the kinds of impacts that we would need to do to really, uh, you know, to really be able to materially make it kind of impossible for this type of genocide to be carried out. And I think that's something too where this can also lead then to this kind of weird thing where it becomes a kind of one-upsmanship. Everything is kind of engaging on social media. You could see how this could relate to like, okay, I'm going to go to Starbucks or I'm going to go to McDonald's because these people didn't do. I mean, you've sort of gamified the genocide to such a degree, right? Where it's just something that happens on social media, and so I'm just going to make fun of it on social media, and you totally dehumanize. It's a really dehumanizing process on the whole. And so I think that too, in terms of like, we do, I think on the left also need to make sure that we aren't allowing ourselves to normalize and um, to allow ourselves to fall into this, like, okay, well, yeah, like I've been through this before, or I know this is going to happen, or I feel, and so therefore, um, you know, people who are coming to consciousness also in these times, like we have to be empathetic and sympathetic too to the fact that we came to consciousness at some point in life, and that was somewhat arbitrary and based on our own experiences, right? And thinking about that difficulty of like welcoming people in who maybe weren't there, and it's like, how were they not there yet? Like, how over the last year were you not there? And yet now, like, here you are, right? And that's something I'm having to like wrestle with myself too, of like, have some humble pie, I guess, around that, and sort of say, okay, like you're here now, so like let's get going, let's like start, this political education, this collective accountability, these projects, etc. And get people to somehow reverse that, because I believe that psychological trend that they're talking about is something that they were, as they're saying, like very conscious in trying to manufacture in us, of
Mhm.
like we want to increase what these people are willing to accept, the kind of discipline that we need to enact on them, you know and what they were talking about too was neoliberalism. I mean, what they were talking about
Yes.
was all of these shocks to workers and to organizing and so on, to make it so difficult for them to then to resist in the ways that they quite easily could in that period, because of the level of employment and the level of organization.
Yeah, and I think that kind of frustration tolerance has affected unions as well, right? Like the level of cruelty that union leaders are willing to accept on behalf of their workers and union members, where the small concessions that can be gotten after decades of rollback of what was fought for and won, I think is a really good indication of that. And I think when it comes to, Israel committing genocide in Gaza and having it being constantly live streamed on our phones, there is a definite kind of like frog in slowly boiling water that I think is happening. And I think a lot of the sudden, outpouring of solidarity even within the US from regular people with Palestinians is a result of that water being cranked up suddenly way too high, right? But I think over time there has been a kind of desensitization to that, even that level of violence, where people can just kind of blindly scroll past, and even having seen the genocide and knowing exactly who's in charge of facilitating and maintaining and funding that genocide in the form of Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, like navigating through that in your head and then making the conscious decision as an effort in harm reduction to vote for them anyway. I think that does something to you. I think it deadens your soul. I think it kills something really important inside of you to make that lesser evil choice. I think it makes you a little bit evil, and then to come out of that, having made that Faustian bargain where you've traded your soul for a single electoral cycle, and then having it not even pay off, where where the compromise you made resulted still in an electoral defeat. I think it's got to fuck you up, like in your head and in your soul, and really have you searching to try to find a way to get that back. And while I personally still think that some of those people like can be redeemed and can find their way to make a positive contribution into movement, I do agree that I think we need to be highly suspicious of those people, who would make that choice after having witnessed a year of genocide and now wanting to be plugged into the solution. I would not begrudge anyone, particularly anyone Palestinian, for being like, fuck that person, fuck those people,
Hmm.
right? Like they don't deserve a shot, and would feel genuinely unsafe organizing with those people. But I do think there are people who are kind of like, who maybe didn't vote this election in particular, who want to try to find some avenue in which they can actually be useful rather than just letting themselves be completely disenfranchised and disengaged from the necessary political work that's going to be required of all of us in order to escape this fascist dystopia that we are living in, and that's only going to get worse under a Trump administration.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's just, it's a big challenge depending on where you live, right, too, because I like where I
Mhm.
live, a majority of the people in my township and whatnot are like, they had 10 Kamala Harris signs on their yard, and so it's like, I mean, it may mean that I have to travel a little bit to do my organizing, or to just find those few people But it's also, I think, one of the big lessons that I see and that I think people have to be really wary of is like definitely don't let those people into any kind of like leadership of what you're going to be doing, right? Because I do think that it is a time where we do have to be a little bit gatekeepy around who is going to be making decisions for our collectives or organizations or whatever. And in terms of like the kinds of things that we're going to be doing and the types of organizing that we're going to be doing and so on, and the political education that's going to be happening. Because, yeah, I mean, I think if people did make that Faustian bargain too, it's like, yeah, I mean, that was the other thing I wanted to say about seeing the frustration or the sadness on the day after, is that I was encountering people who I had been talking to about Palestine for the last year, whose response would be sort of like, "Oh, that's sad," or
Yeah.
you know, I, "Oh yeah." Like very like they couldn't even engage enough to like make a complete sentence around it because they didn't actually care. They didn't, or they weren't interested in really looking at Palestinians as humans in that, or they are really close friends with Zionists, and that's more where or they're Zionists themselves, right? And that's more where their allegiances lied, right? And I think those folks are going to be very dangerous, to
Mhm.
because it's such a telling thing if you could be that broken up, devastated on the way that I was devastated, 100, 200 days over the last year, just
Mhm.
from what I had seen. And then you're devastated by this, and I think that's the
Yeah.
thing is it's like, it's such a, again, it gets to that comment when we talked about Olay earlier, or we talk about the kind of the going to Starbucks or whatever of like, if your politics are so narrow, right, that it's just about you as an individual and what you think is best for you, um, then that's a really tough place to kind of start from, and to organize around some kind of broader solidaristic thing. And we see that in people turning against different groups that traditionally even liberals sort of embrace in a certain way. I think that's an interesting thing we're seeing too in the lessons that Democrats seem to be learning from this election, right? And I think one of the problems with them taking this sort of lesson is that Harris ran an incredibly anti-solidaristic campaign, like on a level that we really haven't seen from the Democratic Party. I don't know in my lifetime, honestly. I mean, to
She
run
actually ran a
on
perfect campaign. She did nothing wrong. It was a
right.
flawless campaign, right?
I mean, but to run on like, yeah, I'm gonna harden the border, I'm gonna deport, I'm gonna do, and then when people say, oh well, but everybody voted for Trump, he's gonna do these things. It's like they both, all of the propaganda that people have been over for the last however long has been about the border is soft and people are just, by the hundreds of thousands coming into the country and they're all criminal. Like this, and this has not been a one party or a one side of media issue over the past year. It has been absolutely a bipartisan, total corporate media message that people have gotten, right? So if they're both running on the same kind of agenda on this issue, it's wild to me that people get mad that people just went with Trump, that like that folks are like, okay, well, if we're against migrants coming in and we're against immigrants and everybody agrees on this, then I'm going to go with the person who's going hardest on this policy. Like, you know, um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing too, is just also that the way that liberalism in this moment has moved so far to the right that it is almost unrecognizable as different from conservatism. So it really does become about the image or the brand or the kind of the affect, the joy that we mix in with our genocide and our, ICE vans and things like this, right? Rather than any kind of political or policy-based difference.
Yeah. Joyful border patrol, right? It's yeah, and another thing just to vent about. I mean, it's actually incredible that kind of like so-called self-branded abolitionists would outwardly stump for and vote for the top cop, right? Uh, for someone who, when they were running in those less than 100 days that they were actually kind of, trying to get people's votes, leaned into the cop experience, right? Rather than try to turn progressively away from it and offer things to their left flank. They went hard right. Like I would say like even more like pro border enforcement than John McCain when he was running. Like the first ad that Kamala Harris put out, it looked like a neo-Nazi advertisement. Like even down to like the music choices and the B-roll choices, like it was an advertisement for Fortress America, and it was terrifying. And you look at all of kind of like the most kind of popular moments in Kamala's very short run, they were all completely right-wing statements. Like she was constantly aggressively hammering on increased border enforcement, that she was going to out border Donald Trump. She was going like Donald Trump's biggest failure with respect to immigration was not being able to finish building the wall, right? And she's like, as president, I'm going to build the wall. and and one of her like biggest most popular moments, aside from what I think probably decided the election, in terms, if we're gonna say that like public statements from candidates can actually influence the election, which I'm skeptical about, highly skeptical about. But like her appearance on The View, where she said that like she would do nothing in terms of economic policy in particular different from Joe Biden. I think the second most decisive factor was when Palestinian protesters were at one of her rallies calling for arms embargo and to end the genocide. That I'm speaking moment, right? It was such a lean in liberal type of clapback that would maybe work if your social media team was posting it online in response to Palestinian activists on Twitter, but really was another mask off moment for how little, not only does people like Harris not care, but that they actively endorse the genocide and are willing to literally silence voices speaking out in favor of humanity, basic humanity. And and I think for a lot of people, they probably, like a lot of like casual liberals, probably didn't know how to feel in a moment like that, right? Where they would support a ceasefire, whatever the hell that means anymore. It's also another one of those nebulous terms that means nothing. But coming from a place of genuine empathy for the people that they're seeing being murdered on their phones, right? Systematically executed and extinguished, and also wanting to find some kind of solution, no matter how false the promise is, in someone like Harris, and then to see that kind of really decisive, dismissive shutdown from a person that they really genuinely want to believe will be a part of the solution. I do think that opens up an opportunity for those people who maybe that was the decisive factor in getting them to stay home, into actually plugging them into a new kind of politics. Yeah, and I think where there are people who can be moved as a result of that, we should definitely, it's definitely our responsibility to attempt to move them. And I think this is one of those moments, but it's not, definitely not the only moment. There are definitely going to be more moments like this that we should definitely, as revolutionaries, take advantage of. But I think it's definitely important to really try to move away from a reactive position, even from the left, to electoral politics, because it's clearly just taking up way too much time and is a doomed project. And I think more people will realize that as time goes on, because the Democrats are just going to continue to tack further and further right with each new electoral cycle, thinking that it's going to work.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, Joshua Palmer's already making fun of me for reading because I do this all the time, reading from the Ungovernable Society at length. But there is a whole other section in it, and I'm not going to read from it. People can go back and look at the elections as counterinsurgency first conversation that I had, but because I read from it there. But they talk about, again, related to this sort of idea of frustration tolerance too, of like that there was a decision in the 1970s that neither political party should attempt to meet the needs of anybody who was um, dissenting, essentially, right? And that this would produce a sort of pendulum effect where people just swing back and forth between the two political parties. That one's not meeting my needs. I want the other one. This one's not meeting my needs. I want, and they do talk about that a real danger in this, that people will ultimately swing to an extra parliamentary position, either a very fascistic one, which I think we are in a moment where this is much more of a reality that we're kind of reckoning with, where if there is if we're thinking about the forces that are politically organized outside of the electoral arena, the right is much more organized in this country than the left is. Um, or that it could produce a kind of revolutionary left outside that might engage in some form of electoral politics, as they say, but primary program would be kind of extra parliamentary or outside of that realm. And I think that, but that was their only fear with this. They were like, other than that, we're just going to keep doing this. And I think that's in a very important moment again of them telling us, if you read what these people say, like this was plotted out, right? So the reason that these politicians increasingly are more and more similar on a policy standpoint, and the reason that neither of them is offering anything real in terms of this will make your life better, this will directly address the needs that you have, is because that's their analysis. This is what neoliberalism intended to do, right? Is to create a scenario in which the left was not able to, you know, actualize real demands on the state of, we want you to address these problems that we have with your system, right? um, because they saw that as a problem for accumulation, right? Just to be clear, like they
Mhm,
saw that as capital will not continue to accumulate at the rates that we need it to if we continue to meet the demands of the oppressed people and of workers. We just don't have enough. We won't be able to make enough profit, basically, if we continue to do that. And so, yeah, you have these diminishing returns, and I think
mhm,
that tack to the right is going to continue, right? And so people need to understand that about the electoral arena of, we're not approaching this from some kind of dogmatic view of like, but it's that's the intention of it, right? And we can try to fight a really really uphill battle in there, but it's a very controlled game. It's, we're talking about people that where billions and billions of dollars are invested. I mean, the campaigns, Kamala's campaign was $1 billion campaign, and like look at what it was, so
yeah.
that's
Spent
not,
twice as much as Trump almost.
yeah,
Yeah, and still
yeah.
couldn't get it. Yeah, yeah.
So
Yeah,
so
I feel
anyways,
like people yeah.
no, go ahead if
No,
you want to
yeah,
say something.
you just yeah, it just reminds me of that, famous Julius Nyerere quote of like, there's, the US, just like many other places, has a one-party system, but with typical American extravagance, they have two of them. Yeah, it's just one party for the ruling class for capital accumulation, and that system, while it is rigged, it's also unsustainable. And I think we're seeing that on the kind of like international world order as well, where the UN has always been kind of like a rigged game since its inception, and with US veto power, right? But we're seeing that come to a head as well. Its logical termination is fast approaching. And I think it's important to also address the fact that the actual path out of this, right, is being demonstrated by the resistance, by the united front against genocide, by Al Qassam, by Al Quds, by Hezbollah and the RGC. Like the actual people who are resisting this world historic slaughter of people in the largest open air besieged prison on the planet is not being demonstrated by voting correctly, right, or voting for the best out of the lesser of two evils. It's being demonstrated by revolutionary armed struggle by people who are fighting to protect their home.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And we got a long ways to go, right? To get ourselves to the position where we can have some kind of meaningful contribution if that is
Mm-hmm.
the struggle, right? And I think yeah, no, I appreciate that. Um I also just want to say, a last sort of comment too of I think it's also really and it should be a really clear moment too for all the rhetoric that the Democratic Party has had about we need to stop fascism and Donald Trump is a fascist dictator and these are Nazis and this kind of thing that has been going on within the Democratic Party for a long time in terms of how they describe Trump and the Republican Party. If that was actually what they believed, then it either shows you one of two things. It either shows you the utter inability of liberalism and the Democratic Party to represent any kind of break against it because, you know, Biden is inviting Donald Trump to lunch so that they can discuss their transition right now, right? And there's no, as someone said online, like if the Democrats were taking that seriously right now, they would be destroying and burning every surveillance file and every piece of, everything that
Mm-hmm.
that the government owns in terms of information about its citizenry. It would be time to destroy that information because the fascists are coming in to rule, right? And so,
Mm-hmm.
one, it either shows you that they're not serious about their own rhetoric at all, or that they are and that they are in on the project, right? And I
Yeah.
mean, I think those are either way, it should tell us quite clearly that this is not the force that we need to align ourselves with as we deal with the rising fascism that exists, that is already here, but that is continuing. It can always get worse. I always implore people to understand that. I mean, I am not an accelerationist in the sense that people talk about when they think, oh, the objective conditions getting worse is going to necessarily produce better organizing and a more revolutionary. No, it could just be a route, right? We could just get
Mm-hmm.
destroyed by fascists as this world ends. We
Yeah.
have to actually organize to produce the alternative. And so, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, do you have anything else that you want to add, Mikey?
Oh, just that I forgot to name drop Ansar Allah in that list of,
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
people engaged in actual disciplined revolutionary struggle. And I just want to also add that all of these political groups that are being demonized as reactionary, particularly by Western liberals, they have a much deeper understanding of U.S. politics than U.S. liberals do. Like they of course were directly calling out the Biden administration for the genocide that they were committing. But many people in these organized resistance factions in West Asia, like they know that there will, like you just mentioned, be a seamless transition between this administration to the next, no matter how many rhetorical disagreements they may have. They're already being like, Trump, we're gonna beat you too, right? I think it was Hezbollah that even also like bombed successfully targeted Trump Heights, right? Which was created in occupied Palestine as a result of Trump moving the embassy to Jerusalem, the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, and establishing Jerusalem as this fake capital of all of occupied Palestine. So the resistance knows that these are two players on the same team, and I think the U.S. Citizens in the Imperial Corps would do well to recognize the same and organize accordingly.
100%. Yeah, if people have questions too, we could take a couple.
Oh yeah.
So this question came up from the audience. Any chance Vietnam syndrome will return? For folks who don't know, Vietnam syndrome and this is just from Wikipedia, so apologies if I'm, getting it wrong, but is a term in U.S. politics that refers to public aversion to American military overseas involvement after the domestic controversy over the Vietnam War. In 1973, the U.S. ended combat operations in Vietnam. I think the problem, I mean, there's a lot of issues with looking at Vietnam as an analog to today. I mean, one, it's important to understand the Vietnam War went on for a very, very long time, and also there was the level of liberation fighters and resistance in Vietnam, and they didn't have like settlers in the same way that you have in occupied Palestine, was just really strong, and there was a lot of weapons being provided to the Vietnamese by Soviet Union and China at different phases and things on, and so um, it's a difficult thing to make a comparison that way. And I also think one of the difficulties is the draft, right? Is that we don't have a draft now. I do think that there is, I don't think, I mean, I think you have a version of this because I think there's a real reason why the United States engages in proxy wars primarily at this point. I don't think that there's a real appetite, and I could be proven wrong here. So I don't, this is just my assessment of the last few years. It doesn't mean that it couldn't change. But I don't think there's a real appetite for large U.S. troop deployments into war zones. And, you know, part of it is they don't necessarily have to engage wars that way because of air power, and because of drones and things like this. You can have a lot of remote, but also they prefer to arm and support other forces to do the fighting for them, whether that is in Ukraine or whether that is in occupied Palestine. And so I don't know that that will be the case, but I do think that, and I know every time I bring this up, people get mad at me because they think I'm like making a pro-Trump point, which I'm genuinely not. But Trump is interesting on foreign policy in certain ways, in terms
Yes.
of he is different than the Democrats around it. He is not, I don't think that he is as much of a war hawk as they are. Now, that could change with the second administration. I know that this administration will be different. It will have different people in it. And so that could change. And he certainly did a lot of bad things in terms of foreign policy when he was there, but he also, wasn't the biggest pro NATO guy. He also did initiate a lot of the withdrawals that happened in Afghanistan and Syria and so on. And so, you know, I think that it's important for people not to like put our hopes on what he might do differently. People have to organize. But I do think that he's a little bit this is the thing people get really mad when I say, but he's a little bit unpredictable, I think, on an international level, in terms of what he might or might not do. I mean, he has said that he wants to end the war between Ukraine and Russia. And I think that that's probably him telling you the truth from what he
Yeah.
feels at this moment. So anyways, that's what I would say. I do think that there is a kind of there's a weird right wing politics that's kind of um, a little bit different on foreign policy in this moment than, but it'll be very anti-China, for instance.
Yeah.
That will be a thing. And it will
Mhm.
be very anti-Iran, and that could produce different things. It could produce a war. Like, I don't think we should be blind to those possibilities.
Yeah. But yeah, I 100% agree. So you're not going to find me arguing with you there. Like I think he's 100%, I'll do, the all the disclaimers. Trump is definitely a fascist, he's a rapist, he's a racist, um deep misogynist, xenophobic. He's all those things. He's also a complete wild card, totally mercurial, totally runs with the wind and what he perceives to be popular opinion. It's partly why he's such a savvy, popular media figure, is because he does have kind of a pulse on the American imaginary, right? Like he knows what people are feeling in any given moment, and he hates losers, right? He doesn't like to lose, and he is a megalomaniac who deeply in an incredibly kind of uniquely insecure kind of way that is I think the hallmark of any psychopath is is that he all he cares about is how it makes him look, right? How any given thing makes him look. And he wants to create a legacy. And so his entire foreign policy is based on that. He wants landmark achievements even more than any regular president, right? It's it's why he crossed the DMZ, right? It's and so while he is completely bought by like the Adelson family fortune, I I do think that he sees what Israel is doing not as any kind of like morally uh condemnable thing, which it is, but as an unpopular, untenable political position. And I think he also views the proxy war in Ukraine as kind of like a money suck, right? And a resource drain. He doesn't view it on any kind of like moral standpoint. He views it as what's going to be good for the future extension of American empire. And I think he correctly assesses the proxy war in Ukraine and the genocide in Gaza as losing propositions. Now, how he decides to address that, I think, is an open question. I think it is just as likely that he could ramp up, probably with like as many kind of like private, like Blackwater style boots on the ground as possible, and an increase, a dramatic increase in funding for arms. But I think even if he does that, I think he can switch on his positions on a dime. And I think the first sight of kind of like a real public military defeat in those regions, I think he's going to, I think it's highly likely that he could pull a full 180 and just withdraw support, and then maybe not so much like a Vietnam syndrome, but like a kind of Rhodesia syndrome where it won't the I think the end of Israel, if that's what we're talking about, won't be a result of kind of like popular dissent and collective and direct actions from people within the US imperial core, but rather from resistance in the ground war.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot to say about Vietnam in which it also followed the same. The reality was that the Viet Cong, the North Vietnamese army, like liberation army, like they defeated the United States, right? And
Yes.
um, you know, at incredible sacrifice, millions of them were killed by the United States in totally ridiculous ways, but um in total, genocidal, war criminal, etc., right? But
Mhm.
at the end of it all, it was not a war that the United States could win. And it is true that there was a lot of, uh, you know, great organizing, great resistance in the United States to that war among anti-war organizers and activists that did all kinds of things that we're not organized, unfortunately, to do in this moment.
Mhm.
Um, but that is, I think, definitely a secondary thing. It did produce this thing though, where they were worried. They're like, okay, we need to actually move beyond the draft.
Yeah.
We need to, because they recognized that the draft would continue to produce that type of internal dissent, and they didn't want to have to constantly kind of reckon with that and what it did in terms of people developing kind of revolutionary and anti-systemic kind of politics in response to those things. And I think that's somebody asked if the draft would be reinstated, and that's why I always think not.
Yeah.
um Now, I don't, if it got to a level. It's also why I don't think the United States will engage in a hot war with China when people like propose that idea. Um, which I again, like, these are you're asking people to make predictions, and that's always really dangerous and fraught because you just never know what's gonna happen, but, um,
Mhm.
I don't think that the idea that the United States, would be willing to deal with a draft and would be willing to deal with millions of people, dying in a war, or even hundreds of thousands. Like, I just don't think those are realities that the United States, I think we're too pampered in a certain way as a society that, we kind of know. I mean, it's sort of Abdul Jawad Omar talks a lot about Israelis in this way to some degree in their own military, and the fact that they don't really want to engage in actual combat. They use remote forms of warfare as much as possible. They
Mhm.
go into areas after they've been really cleared by air power, and obviously they're still attacked by, whether it's
Mhm.
Al Qassam or whether it's Hezbollah, but you see the kind of inability of, you know, a kind of troop driven, like he talks about it as like a kind of a heroism or a post heroic form of warfare, like where people aren't
Mm.
willing to actually engage in kind of direct combat. And I think you know, that's the kind of reality that we have in the United States to an even much greater degree because, our military just hasn't engaged in those kinds of wars in a very long time.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and I mean, there are Israelis, who have been deployed several times, in the IOF back to Gaza, and they are literally killing themselves to avoid going back to the front. Yeah, and so, yeah, if you look at Israel, as a colony that I wouldn't say is necessarily. I used to say that, Israel is just a straight up proxy of the United States, but I think it's a little different at this stage. I think it's just kind of like a global imperialism in which there's it's all part of like one, kind of unified political project that is a, just deeply invested in the Zionist project. And I think while there are significant differences in terms of the character of Israelis within the colony and States citizens within the U.S. settler colony, I think it is correct to draw some close comparisons. I think g- on the subject of Israel, like prior to October 7th in 2023, we were seeing these like pro democracy judicial reform protests from Israelis, and I think a lot of people understandably dunked on them for, like waving the Israeli flag and wanting to have a better Israel, a more accountable Israel, despite lacking even a constitution, for these judicial reforms that were not reforms that would help, colonize Palestinians, but just to create a better quote unquote democracy for settler citizens. And I think there's something to be said about the visuals and the optics and just the plain hypocrisy and lack of self-awareness in those protests, and comparing it to people in the heart of the great Satan, right? Also, mourning a potential loss of democracy under a Trump presidency. I think it's really rich, for liberals to be mourning that while not mourning, the catastrophic Holocaust that was committed by the current administration for over the past year.
yeah. And I think we should probably wrap up, but I think that's kind of one of the points for me in terms of understanding this kind of counterinsurgent function of these elections too, is to understand that like so much of the Democratic campaign, forget the Republican campaign. I mean, obviously it's horrible. Like that so much of it was aimed at, push all of this horror that you are seeing that we are actually the architects of. Push that to the side and, vote for me. And then, you know, I'm still going to do the same thing afterward, but, I will continue to give you this rhetoric about like, I do care about children in Gaza, and whatever. And it's like, again, like if people accept that, if people are willing to say, okay, I'm going to set this aside and go along with that, and then when they're upset that they don't win, and then they lash out at all of these different folks, like, again, this has been produced through this process. You know what I mean? Of like, these are
Mhm.
your choices within our society. Not being for genocide is actually not on the table within these elections.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that it has a deep impact on a people, and I think that that's really, you know, it's really dangerous, and I think it's, again, like you said, I think it's why a lot of us, in thinking about how are we going to organize and whatnot, like, you know, yeah, thinking about people who didn't vote as, a good constituency of people that, you might want to build with too. People who just implicitly kind of understood this is actually not a choice that, matters to me or that I want to participate in.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is like, yeah, a really kind of large demographic to try to organize and radicalize. Yeah, because it's a group of people who could not, based on their own conscience and their sense of a shared humanity and a shared sense of value for human life and all life on this planet, where they couldn't co-sign a genocide. Those are people we can work with. Those are people we can organize. The other folks, not so much.
All right. Well, thanks, Mikey. This has been great. I appreciate your
Thank you.
time.
Yeah.
I appreciate you doing this at an ungodly hour in your part of the world. And so,
Anytime.
yeah, we'll have to do it again.
Absolutely.
All right.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you.